that I would hear a lot in when I was younger and I worked for an attorney in Portland, and he handled pretty much everything except uh, domestic divorces and stuff like that. At one point, he did, but being around that environment and being around people who had to help mediate and mitigate those sorts of issues when the relationships ultimately break down, a lot of what you hear is what gets and to be fair, a relatively harsh stigma is codependent relationships.
Mm.
And to your point, like what you said, part of having a healthy relationship, as we all kind of understand it, is you get your space. You're able to go to work, you're able to go to the gym. You have a life outside of this central relationship, whether it be a marriage or a long term relationship or even a new relationship. And the pandemic seems like that took it away and almost required people for a certain amount of time to be codependent and in that kind of codependent mold. Did you see any evidence of that in the last year?
Yeah, well, one of the things to like kind of sort out is like what's your responsibility uh, for uh, coping with the stress and dealing with anxiety, with dealing with depression, dealing with your responsibilities. Um, but in relationship, when we care about someone, like we want to support and help someone. Um, what was hard is usually you take turns, right? Like if someone's having a bad day, they're struggling, they had a hard time at work, then your partner will like be there for you and support you and listen, and encourage you, and then you take turns, like, and then you have a bad day and then they do that for you. But what happened was just the chronic stress of all the turmoil, not just the pandemic, but all the racial unrest, all the political upheaval. Um, were just under constant stress this last year. So like everybody's having a bad day, and it's a tough spot when you're both struggling
Right.
emotionally. And you're like, I don't have anything to give. Like I am not healthy. I'm not doing great. You're not doing great. And we have all these emotional needs that are being unmet. And it's like, uh, we can't help each other. We can't be there for each other. Um, and the more you struggle, the more you start to buy into that and believe that. Um, and so it's kind of like a downward spiral, right,
Right.
with mood. Um, and so it's and then getting support from for friends and family, right? You go out on the weekend, you go for a hike, you talk to your friend, you hopefully grab a mentor who's been through it and they can encourage you and like say like this is normal, you guys are going to get through it. Like, but we're so isolated and disconnected.
Right. And I think that kind of once we understood that, yeah, you can't go out and you can't really socialize except online through a format like this. I mean,
Right.
I think that helped people cope to an extent, but again, being in close proximity to people when you can't, when the closest you could be is 6 feet, and you've got to make sure that you're bundled up as best you can because you don't know if you may be in a situation where somebody you care about ends up getting sick. That
Yeah.
adds to the pressure. And like you said, I mean, everything, especially in the last calendar year, let alone I think it had been building up over the last 4 or 5 years of all this stuff of with the economy and with politics. And we saw that fragmentation, especially in the last 4 to 5 months after the election, of people who don't know what is going to come next. All they know is what's happening and what they have been told through whatever media or whatever outlets they get their information from while cloistered in their little bubble,
Right.
what's coming next and what they need to be afraid of. I've seen a lot of it with friends of mine. Who I have one friend in Chicago that she's having a really, really hard time with her mom because her mom is really, really in a bad mental state just because of what's been happening politically, to say nothing else about the vax or about the pandemic and the issue of the vaccines and the economy and all that stuff. It's just this one thing that's really fractured their relationship. As a counselor,
Yeah.
how do you go about trying to get people to start getting back to a central point where they can even begin to connect?
Mhm. That's the $1 million question. That's tough, Devin. Well, I think one of the key things that I work with folks. So I do health coaching, do phone appointments, and do individual and marriage counseling. But one of the main things all last year was talking about limiting the external inputs, the social media, the news. I mean, I'm talking with folks. They're at home. They're retired. Um, they're they've got knee and hip problems, so they're not very mobile. I mean, they're listening to the news 14, 16 hours a day, like just all day. And the uh, and the mind body connection. We are influenced and impacted by the content that we consume.
Absolutely.
And so how do you get back to connection and like get grounded? It's super hard because the inputs are so different,
Mhm.
right? Getting on the same page, and attuning and aligning with people, even though if we're very different, we're losing common decency and common ground. And so the more we listen to these different channels of content, the further and further we get apart.
Right. I mean, I, as a journalist, as somebody who has been knee deep in how this stuff has been produced and seeing how that evolution has gone for the last 15 years, let alone for the last 5 or 6, I've had people tell me, how can you stand it? Because I'm part of the problem, just by being in it, and
Yeah.
for me, that's I take that seriously because one, you're absolutely right in that we are governed by all the external stimulus that we encounter in a day, a week, a month, a year. And if you are constantly letting yourself be being bombarded with all this stimuli that tells you that this perceived outcome is going to happen, even though there's contrarian evidence to suggest that no, it's not, the longer you stay in that, the more of an effect that's going to have on you. My dad was like that. My
Mm,
dad passed away 2 years ago, and for the last, I'd say 5, 10 years of his life, and like the elderly patients that you've talked to, he was in his 60s and 70s. He wasn't physically mobile. He wasn't working anymore. Uh, but he spent all his time just consuming extreme media online.
mm,
And when he would call me and start just sounding off to me on it, I would have to explain to him from a trying to be rational and saying, no, dad, this is not everything you're seeing. No. And I can give you evidence upon evidence upon evidence to the contrary. But he was just in such a mind state that he just did not want to believe it, and in a lot of ways, that was kind of his tragedy of thinking that's how the world was, as opposed to how the world is, if you can just change your perception a little bit and let your perception be changed. And I know, also speaking as somebody who has dealt with mental illness for a long time and built up a lot of coping mechanisms, some helpful, some not. I know that's not an easy thing to do. So I mean, from your point of view, what are coping mechanisms right now that people can start trying to build up that might help them kind of get out of the rut they're in?
So there's three areas of life that affect each other. So being healthy and taking a look at how am I doing in these areas can definitely and can help with this. So taking a look at like uh, our thought life, our mindset. So part of the framework for counseling that I use is cognitive behavioral therapy, and you
Hmm.
might be familiar with it. It's commonly used for anxiety and depression,
Yep, that's part
and
of what I used.
yeah, and insomnia, and it's just looking at the mind body connection. So, our how is my mindset and my thought? How are my thoughts affecting the rest of my life? Especially, how are my thoughts affecting me emotionally? How are my thoughts affecting my choices? And the uh, the messages outwardly, but for a lot of folks, especially folks that struggle with anxiety, is sometimes the hardest thing that they're dealing with isn't what they're watching or reading on social media or on the news. It's their own internal dialogue.
It's how they
Um,
process it.
yeah, yeah. And so uh, taking a look, you know, how am I doing with cynicism and criticism and fear and anger? Um, uh, Anger is an emotion. So what am I thinking about? It influences how we feel, our emotions, um, and then it's a positive or negative feedback loop. How we're doing emotionally starts to affect how we interpret things and what we're thinking. So here's an example. Like uh, we, when I'm talking with clients, we look at emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is, if it feels bad, then it is bad. And so uh, it's really tough when you get into when you're dealing with anxiety or feeling overwhelmed, or depression. You're just struggling to get out of bed, to get going. You're struggling to do not just the things that you're responsible for and need to do, but you're struggling even with the things that would be fun. um, like some folks, they struggle working at home from home because they're on Instagram or on ESPN, or they're playing video games. But you can get to the point where you're struggling, where you can't even do that.
Right.
um, and so um, looking at how you're doing emotionally, and then uh, your healthy habits, healthy rhythms, your daily rhythms, your weekly rhythms, how we're doing with our physical health impacts how we feel, impacts how we're thinking. Um, and so looking at those different areas and seeing if there's any room for improvement, like in the physical health realm, like healthy eating, physical activity, getting enough sleep. Those are the basics, but like the basics are everything.
Right.
you know um, it's it's like baseball players when their batting goes off. They go back to the tape and they're like, am I doing the basics?
Hey guys, Devin here. Thanks for watching. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and check out the links below for more great original content. Talk to you soon. Bye.